you for joining us this morning to talk about this important topic of universal preschool. It fits very well in the theme of this meeting of connecting research with policy. And it's an example of where research evidence has informed policy and where there's still more that needs to be done. And so we'll be talking about some of those next directions that some of you in the audience may be working on and may be helping us fill the gaps. Our panelists today will follow the order that was in the program. Our Stephen Barnett, Director of the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University, Dal Farron, Professor of Education and Psychology and Senior Associate Director of the Peabody Research Institute at Vanderbilt University. I'll then talk about my work with colleagues, and I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Associate Director of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And finally, Libby Doggett will be our discussant, and she's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education. So I'll bring up Steve's slide so he can kick us off. And he's an important start for us because he's been one of the leaders leveraging research to inform policies around universal preschool. You want to come up here?
Thank you, Rachel. Good to be here this morning. So, it's afternoon now. I'd like to start off with addressing 4 specific questions about pre-K for all in the United States. Why do I think that, based on the evidence, states, localities in the U.S. ought to offer universal, high-quality public pre-K? I think the 4 questions that need to be answered in moving to that more general proposition. First is, does high-quality preschool education produce persistent gains or just temporary gains? Can the gains from preschool that we see in some studies be replicated on a large scale? Third, how well does targeting, which is the alternative to universal programs and an alternative we followed for about 50 years now, how well does that actually work for children in poverty that it's intended to serve? And finally, do only the most disadvantaged children benefit, or are the needs for early education and the benefits of early education possibly widespread? Now, most of the rationale for this depends on looking at pre-K as an investment. I'm an economist. I've been studying investing in preschool education for more than a couple of decades at this point. And there's a set of studies that produce not just evidence of short-term impacts on kids. We have hundreds of studies that do that, but long-term impacts, a much smaller number. But if we look across studies, we see gains in achievement test scores, decreases in special education and grade repetition, increases in high school graduation or post-secondary school attendance, decreases in behavior problems, delinquency, and crime, increases in employment earnings, decreases in welfare dependency, decreases in risky behavior like smoking and drug use, and some indicators of improved health. We see these things in multiple studies, although not necessarily in a lot of studies. All of these things have big implications for the costs of government: decreased schooling costs, decreased social services costs, decreased crime costs, decreased health care costs. And if we look at the major political debates, not just in the United States, but in many other countries, about the future of government, these costs are driving a debate about what will our future look like. And this debate is often about, are we going to increase taxes, which nobody likes, or are we going to decrease services, which nobody likes? But the costs of all these things have been increasing fairly rapidly, leaving us, most people have said, with only these two choices. Well, I think we have another choice, which is to try to decrease the problems that are the sources of these costs. Pre-K is not by any means the only answer, the only response to that problem. But I think it's one response, and I think that's what, to some extent, elevates it above just being an issue with early childhood education to an issue with national public policy. Now, my job as an economist has been to try to figure out what the economic returns are to investing in early education, and for the most part, we only have studies of disadvantaged kids to do this. And we really only have 3 long-term studies which have been the basis for comprehensive benefit cost analysis. And you can see we have very specific estimates of costs and benefits. None of these programs are particularly inexpensive. 2 of them are very intensive. The third, the Chicago Child Parent Center study, is much like what I would call better state pre-K or local school pre-K programs, certainly not typical or average in either its implementation, quality, or cost. Benefits of all of these are considerably larger than costs, and I'm not going to make any points about exactly what these benefit cost ratios are. You can see they're very large. They differ substantially from each other, and the truth is, given confidence intervals around them, most accurate representation is probably to say benefits are large relative to cost. Now, if we move away from a small number of studies to say, okay, but what do we get if we look at all of the evidence? This is a meta-analysis by Greg Camilli and colleagues of basically all of the preschool studies, not just treatment versus control, but treatment A versus treatment B studies, looking at the impacts of preschool programs where there are longer-term outcomes since 1960. There's 123 studies in this data set. You have to have some kind of counterfactual to be in the data set, so it's not inclusive of all studies, but only studies that meet a basic and a fairly low bar for rigor. And this chart shows you estimated effect sizes across all designs and studies. That's the yellow bar. Across more rigorous designs, which are more rigorous quasi-experimental and experimental studies, that's the blue bar. And the red bar says, well, what if some programs are more effective than others? What if we tweak that and basically do a simulation and say, what would the distribution of effect sizes look like if programs were like those that were more effective rather than less effective? And you can see, right, across all the studies, average effect sizes in the red bar close to a full standard deviation immediately, much smaller longer term, but they do not disappear, right? And whether they're a third as large as initial effect sizes, half as large as initial effect sizes, I think to some extent depends on which measures you're looking at. Simple literacy measures like how many letters kids know wash out pretty quickly. Most kids will learn all their letters fairly rapidly in kindergarten. But if you're looking at language or broad mathematics, then I think you're looking at deeper, broader domains where you have to do a lot more to produce large initial effects, but where perhaps there's more carryover in terms of what the effects are. Well, what else did we learn from the meta-analysis besides that effects, although they become smaller later on, do persist to some extent? One, intentional teaching matters. Programs that had intentional teaching produced larger effects than those that did not. This is not whole group direct instruction, however, because we also found that one-on-one and small group intentional teaching increased gains more than other approaches. Programs that had comprehensive services produced smaller gains. I don't think this means that comprehensive services actually harm kids, social services, health services, et cetera, but I do think it means that if you take too little money and spread it over too many things, you are less effective. Clearly, you need to produce very large initial gains to have long-term gains that are detectable. And I think it's interesting that all of the programs that produce big long-term gains that I could identify had programs that extended over more than 1 year. Well, why are long-term effects small in large-scale public pre-K programs? Well, one reason is that public programs, public schools later help low performers catch up. As an economist, I've had to try to explain to people that the idea that effects persist, or I should say that the idea that effects decline over time, and that we have a lot of cost savings from things like grade repetition and special education are not inconsistent. Right? They're actually two sides of the same coin. We're spending a lot of money to help kids catch up. A second reason is I believe a lot of these studies are intent to treat. Intent to treat studies underestimate outcomes typically. And then initial effects in many of the studies are very modest. Head Start and some other programs use the weak comprehensive services model. Many public programs besides those are very poorly funded. They only have very small initial effects. When you look later on and the effects are even smaller, you're not likely to detect anything. Now, having put Head Start in this category of weakly effective programs, I think it's important to note that the best evidence we have on that, and certainly the evidence that most people talk about, is for the National Impact Study, which are kids who were in the program in 2002. That doesn't mean that accurately and clearly the effects were modest at best initially, do not persist to any great extent. At least as they're detectable, and detectable range in the impact study is about 0.1. If you're smaller than that, you're going to be they're not going to find it. But I think we have improved Head Start in the time since then, and I think the FACES study, just looking at child gains, particularly in language and literacy, show that, and you can see 2003, 2006, 2009, white, black, Hispanic kids. It looks like Head Start gains have steadily improved over that period of time. Now, I want to talk about what I think of as kind of demonstration proof of the ability of large-scale public preschool for all programs to have an impact. So New Jersey's Abbott preschool program is of much higher quality than most public preschool programs in the United States, for the most part because it was court-ordered rather than created by a legislature or governor on their own. And I think it is the closest approximation to a kind of peri-preschool model in terms of its implementation. Kids begin at 3, all teachers have a BA in early childhood certification. There's an assistant teacher with a teacher in each classroom. It's a full-day school year, 6 hours, 180 days. Maximum class size is limited to 15. You have to use an evidence-based curriculum. There are very strong early learning standards and program guidelines. There's an intensive support for children who have potential learning difficulties with special teams that work with teachers in the classroom. There's extensive professional development and coaching, transportation, health, and other services as needed. Most of these kids were in preschool programs when we started. The yellow bar shows you on the early childhood environment rating scale, not a terribly high bar for quality in my opinion, but 5 is good, and you can see the vast majority of programs when we started were below good, and you can see a number of years later the vast majority of them now score better than good. So that's a dramatic change in these classrooms that children were in. What did we see as results of that? Well, we did a variety of different kinds of studies to look at the initial impacts of the programs. This is what we find for long-term impacts. The effect sizes for 1 year of preschool or in 4th, 5th grade are around 0.15. The effect sizes for 2 years of preschool are between 0.2 and 0.4. If you look at what happened with grade retention in special education, you can see there's substantial declines in that for kids who went to preschool. But there's still substantial grade repetition and special education going on for these kids, even if they did go to preschool. Shifting grounds a little bit. So that's what I think we can accomplish with a public pre-K program. What have we been doing with targeting over the last 50 years? How well has it worked? Well, we still don't serve, we don't even have capacity for more than about half the kids in poverty. So over 50 years, we don't seem to have been able to make that happen. Programs remain poorly funded with low salaries for teachers and have smaller effects, much smaller effects than expected, and it's still viewed as charity or a luxury to be cut in difficult times. However, the situation is actually worse than that in terms of access for poor kids, because many of the kids in targeted programs are in fact not poor. In part that's because there's an incentive for programs and families to cheat, but it's more because poverty is itself a moving target, and that's a good thing. But it means this idea that you're going to target kids based on family income doesn't work particularly well, and especially doesn't work well over 2 years. By the end of the second year of Head Start, half the kids in Head Start are no longer poor, so that means now you're really only reaching about a quarter of your target population. And finally, I think there's some research indicating that low-income children benefit more from attending pre-K with a more diverse group of kids. That is, the kids learn from each other and not just from teacher in the classroom. Unfortunately, good preschool is rare. If you look at the graph, you can see that it gets more rare the less education your parents have, despite the targeted programs that we have. I'm not sure exactly how bad it would be if we didn't have targeted programs, but it's clear that despite targeted programs, it's pretty bad. So I'm running, or have run out of time, and I'm going to sprint to the end here. If we look at the abilities of kids when they enter kindergarten, cognitive and social, it becomes clear that what we talk about as an achievement gap is not a gap, but a gradient. So yes, poor kids are behind kids in the middle. Middle kids are as far behind kids in the top income quintile as poor kids are behind them. I would argue that means we have a readiness problem, not just for children in poverty, but for children all the way up toward the top of the income distribution. We have a number of studies, including a randomized trial we conducted in Rhode Island where slots were reserved for middle-income kids, that show that not just poor kids, but middle-income kids can benefit. We have similar studies from Europe. All of these studies tend to show that low-income, disadvantaged migrant kids benefit more than other kids, but that there are still benefits for non-disadvantaged kids. So what does this mean in terms of looking at the costs and benefits? Well, clearly targeted programs are lower costs, but I'd argue they have a lot fewer benefits for the poor kids they're meant to serve, and fewer benefits because there are no benefits at all from the non-poor kids that they don't serve. On the pre-K for all side, I'd argue, yes, the costs are higher, but because we get much better coverage of low-income children, because we now cover non-disadvantaged children who also have some problems, and that there are benefits for all of these kids, that if you total up the costs and benefits, it actually turns out that despite its greater expense, the net return is higher for pre-K for all. So in conclusion, 50 years of mean-tested program have largely failed. Universal pre-K has achieved full coverage and higher quality. I don't think that can be denied at this point. Universal pre-K permits positive peer effects and systemic changes you don't get with the disadvantaged, program limited to disadvantaged kids. Universal pre-K can benefit all kids at the same times that it reduces inequality. And finally, universal program plausibly yields a larger net economic benefit with an adequate, if lower, rate of return. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll now turn the mic over to Dale Farron, who will talk about their Tennessee pre-K evaluation.
Thank you. I'm glad to see, I can't actually see you way back in the back, but I'm very glad to be here and speaking in this huge room. A caveat first. Unfortunately, this debate about pre-K has sometimes boiled down to just a debate about pre-K and whether or not you're an advocate of pre-kindergarten programs. I personally am an advocate for our trying to do something about those outcomes that Steve listed, the outcomes that we know are associated with growing up in poverty, and we need some remedy that helps us prevent those health outcomes, occupational outcomes, and so forth. Now we have to decide, is pre-K part of that remedy, or if it is, how should it be part of that remedy? And I think that's a better discussion than being pro or anti-pre-K. And whenever you do a study, it's incredibly humbling. So that's what I'm going to tell you. This is a humbling study. I'm lucky to have a lot of people humbled with me. The Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K Program is, I think, a good example of scaling up pre-K to a statewide level. It serves 4-year-old children. It gives a priority for children who qualify for free and reduced price lunch. It meets the standards of 5.5 hours per day, a minimum of 180 days per year, and like many states, it went by the NEAR guidelines or benchmarks, and it meets 9 of the 10 of them. The one it doesn't meet is that the teacher assistants don't have a CDA. And they have a list of approved curricula. So there was every expectation that having met all those benchmarks, this would be an effective program. It was scaled out fairly rapidly, though. There are 934 pre-K classrooms now in 133 of the 136 Tennessee school systems in 95 counties. And in part, that rapid rollout from sort of mid-2000s was because to get buy-in, which is, I think, what happens in a lot of universal programs. You roll it out rapidly because you want parents to like it and to lobby their legislators to keep it. But in fact, with the exception now of the Head Start study, there have been no RCTs, well, there are no RCTs, randomized controlled trials, that follow kids longitudinally from a scale-up study like this. So, anybody out there who thinks they might want to replicate this, talk to me first. Because what we did, we randomized wait list in oversubscribed schools. It took the school systems a little while to get on board with how to do this exactly, even those who were willing. So it took 2 cohorts to get the number of kids we needed. But eventually, we have now a full sample of about 3,000 children, somewhere around 1,700 who were randomly assigned to go to pre-K and about 1,300 who are on the control list, and those are kids we are tracking through the state database. We were able to consent almost 1,100 of those children with their parents for individual assessments, and 773 of those were in VPK, and 330 were not. Now, just so you follow what Steve was saying, we chose to do these initial analyses of the treated on treated. Now, some of our methodological purists would say, well, wait, that's not right. This is a randomized design, which is why we've been downgraded now to be quasi-experimental. But anyway, so, but the state really, we were working in partnership with the state, and they didn't really understand why we weren't going to assess all the kids who got VPK compared to all the kids who didn't get VPK in our sample, and that's what we've done. So we used some pretty standard early childhood assessments. We assessed in the area of literacy, we assessed in the area of language, we assessed in math, and then we developed an overall Woodcock-Johnson composite score. So these children are typical of the state. In pre-K, they were a little over 4 on average. About half of them were male. All the people in our sample were free and reduced price lunch. The state of Tennessee is ethnically diverse, so we have about 57% white, 23% black, 18% Hispanic, Asian, 2%, and so forth. Where did the kids go who were not in pre-K, who were in the control group? Well, interestingly enough, not dissimilarly to the Head Start study, the majority of them stayed home. So it's important for legislators to all right, I'll be quicker. Here's where they were. Boom. Okay. So we get initial, so we're measuring them as they go into kindergarten. We get initial positive results. We actually pre-post tested both the control group and those who got the program, and we have improvement significant in all areas. But when they hit kindergarten, what you'll see is all those differences disappeared. Now, I'm not going to show you, we don't have time to show you plots, but if you think of what happened as the children declined, you don't see graphs like that. What you see is a continued acceleration of learning in the VPK kids and a rapid catch-up to that line from the control group. So we also had what, for lack of a better term, people are calling non-cognitive outcomes. So we had teacher ratings at the beginning of kindergarten and at the end of first grade. We used a set of ratings that are classroom-based. And we get information from the State Education Information System on retention and grade and attendance. The last 3 are so wishy-washy for kids this age that we're waiting till they stabilize a little bit. So what happened to teacher ratings? Well, at the beginning of kindergarten, so now we have the control kids who are coming into kindergarten, VPK kids coming into kindergarten, and within about 6 to 8 weeks, we get their kindergarten teachers to rate them. And the VPK kids are seen as better, more ready for kindergarten, for sure. And they are better prepared for grade. Their work-related skills in the classrooms are better. Now we look at at the end of first grade, what their teachers rate them as. And there are no differences any longer in those classroom behaviors. We do see differences in grade retention. This is only in kindergarten, so we see more of the non-VPK kids retained in kindergarten in the full sample and in our intensive sample. We see some differences in attendance favoring the VPK children. So to summarize, we have achievement outcomes from VPK that were positive at the end of pre-K and were not sustained even into kindergarten. We have non-cognitive outcomes, so we see positive effects at the beginning of kindergarten on their teacher ratings, and then those effects are not sustained through the end of first grade. We do see some effects on school records, on retention and attendance. However, our recent data, which I don't have up there for the full sample, shows that by the end of first grade, there are no differences in the two groups in retention. So let's put this in context. I think there are. Steve has his meta-analysis. I have mine. This is sort of warring meta-analyses. This was published by Doug and group in an economics journal, so you have to go search it out. But anyway, it's a meta-analysis from last year, 2013. And he has graphed the effect sizes of programs like Perry Preschool and the Abecedarian program and done it by, and on the bottom you'll see time when these programs were instituted. For those of you maybe not used to reading effect sizes, they have to do with a standard deviation of a standardized test. So let's take, if you're familiar with standardized tests, if 15 points is a standard deviation, then effect size of 1 would be 15 points. An effect size of 0.5 would be 7.5 points. So it goes like that. You want to be higher in your effects. Okay, so that looks great. But what about Perry? I worked for Abecedarian for 10 years. What about Perry and Abecedarian? They were implemented in the 60s and 70s. The counterfactual, what they're being compared to, was much more limited at that time. They were small, focused, very intense programs. heavily guided by on-site invested researchers and much more extensive, particularly the Abecedarian program, which actually ran from 6 weeks to age 5. And on the floor with where the infants and toddlers were housed was a pediatrician and a nurse. And they were full working day, not school day, and 12 months a year. But these are the studies. Yes, they were. Not Perry, I'm talking Abecedarian. These are the studies that are used to justify pre-K intervention for poor children, though larger, more current studies do not replicate early effects. So here's Greg's meta-analysis. Oh, dadgummit, you weren't supposed to see that yet. There we go. So up through 2005, including the Head Start Impact Study, you'll see these decreasing effect sizes from these programs particularly as they get larger and larger. And the Tennessee VPK program is right in there with them. It looks like it's about similar to other large-scale programs with an immediate, these are all immediate effect sizes of ours was about 0.33, which is about what many of these studies are showing. So what are the issues? I personally think we lack a coherent vision for what pre-K should be and accomplish. And we need to be thinking about the real needs of young children and crafting environments that facilitate that growth. What's happening is we are focusing, a lot of these programs that I'm in, they're focusing on what I call the low-hanging fruit. And they do, a lot of if those effects are being carried by impact on concrete school-like readiness skills, letters and numbers. You don't see the same effects on language and math. I believe that improving particularly language, but also math, is going to require some rigorous research effort on our part to figure out how you do that in a classroom of 20 with two adults in there. And we really haven't figured out how to embed good language opportunities, learning opportunities for children in that kind of setting. And I think the programs, if they get scaled out, they'll have minimum cost, minimum required program elements, they'll scale up easily, but perhaps without the important or lasting results that we expect from the Perry and Abecedarian programs. I think a strong vision is critical when scaling up at a statewide level. School systems are highly independent, and they're really hard to direct. If you don't have a coherent vision that's just sort of beating them over the head, they'll go off and do what they want to do. But even for an effective program, it'll be a challenge at scale to maintain consistent positive effects across all classrooms. So as they're scaled up, I think we have to be committed to collecting rigorous data to determine variations among individual classrooms and implementing systems for improvement. Not just judging, but improving. As researchers and advocates, we need to be much more intentional and systematic in our own efforts to help pre-K achieve its potential. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to bring up our presentation here. And I'm going to be talking, oops. About how we learn whether we're assuring the kind of quality that Steve and Dale were talking about. So we have a goal to be sure that kids have access to quality, but how do we monitor that? Are we sure we're monitoring the right things and with the right measures? And this is collaborative work with one of Dale's colleagues, Carrie Hoffer at Vanderbilt University. And I want to acknowledge our IES funding and our research team. Several of our graduate students are here in the audience today, and prior IES and NIH funding for the results that I'm going to talk about. So the policy initiatives that Dale and Steve were talking about do focus on this high-quality preschool, and Libby's going to talk about the President's Initiative, which does so as well. So I show here the opening paragraph from the White House's early learning site, which calls for expanding access to high-quality early childhood education. and contends that participation in high-quality early learning programs is going to provide children with a strong start and foundation for success. And we saw the evidence that suggests that that's the case. But what is high quality? This seems like a simple question at first glance, but it's really difficult when you delve down into it. And in the case of early care and education, thinking carefully about this question and how to answer it has increasing importance. With this push toward expanding access to high-quality preschool, measures designed for other purposes have been adopted for high-stakes use. And as an example of this high-stakes use of the measures themselves, I'm going to talk about quality rating improvement systems, which states have been increasingly adopting since the 1990s, and increasingly they incorporate the universal preschool programs in the states as well. So they have multiple goals, but they usually have some high-stakes purpose. So they help parents choose high-quality preschool, or they give incentives and higher subsidies to centers that have higher ratings. They're similar to restaurant ratings with stars that designate which are higher quality. Illinois launched its new system this year, and it has a bronze, silver, and gold rating here. And we're showing an example of Illinois' early learning environment. And we see that there are separate standards, but similar standards for licensed child care centers, Preschool for All, which is our universal preschool program, and Head Start. And important for what I'm talking about today is that each criteria refers to two measures that have been widely used. Steve talked about the first one that I'm going to talk about here, the Environment Rating Scale, which is the ECHRS in centers. And I have a pullout there to show you that in Illinois' QRIS, centers can meet the gold standard by achieving particular cutoffs on the ECHRS, and these have to be verified by an independent assessor. And CLASS, the Classroom Assessment and Scoring System, is another increasingly used measure. And so Illinois uses this as a second way to reach gold standard. And you can see, again, very specific cutoffs that have to be verified by an on-site independent assessment. So is there evidence for these very specific cutoffs for these high-stake uses? So I'm going to take a look at the case that these were both measures that were developed for other purposes. They have limitations for these high-stakes uses, and I'm going to talk about a rationale for rethinking how we verify program quality and establishing research policy practice partnerships to support a next generation of quality measures. I'm going to start by examining evidence about whether the scales predict child outcomes. So Steve and Dale were talking about treatment versus counterfactual, treatment versus control. I'm going to be talking about whether we understand variation in quality within context and how that relates to child outcomes in this case. This aspect of quality is relevant because, as we heard about, the public investments are banking on promoting optimal child development and school readiness. And measures like ECHRS and CLASS weren't designed to identify programs that are meeting those goals specifically. And increasingly, we're recognizing that associations with child outcomes are actually small in size. So this is a graph from our recent meta-analysis where we looked at ECHRS total scores associations with outcomes in a dozen secondary data sets. This set is for a set of Head Start studies as well as a pre-K study. And you can see that the effect sizes are small. The overall effect size is 0.02 and not significant. And other work shows similar modestly small sizes. There are modestly larger associations if we look at subscales that may be more aligned with children's outcomes, and some but small evidence about interactions by risk or disadvantage. There was a recent publication in Child Development, for example, that looked for interactions across a host of family-child characteristics and found just a handful, and the association of class with outcomes, looking at the instructional support subscale of class, which may be more aligned with language outcomes, was small again at 0.04. There's also little evidence for the specific cutoffs that I showed you in the QRIS. This is an an example from our work where we stacked 4 FACES data sets, 4 of the national Head Start surveys, so that we'd have more sample size and power to look within each of the 1-unit increments of the scale and see if there were threshold points that might align with cutoffs. We found no evidence of those thresholds in piecewise linear models. You may see a slightly higher association in the higher quality range, and between 5 and 6, that was the only region with a significant association, but it's still small, modest at 0.16. So there may be many different reasons for these small associations of ECRs and class scores with child achievement outcomes. One possibility is low validity and other more fundamental features of the measures. And we've also been contributing to the knowledge base about these aspects of quality, at least as they relate to those that may promote school readiness. So I'll tell you just a taste of what we're looking at with the ECRs. Thinking about how the items mix different aspects of quality and how the standard scoring makes it difficult to pull out aspects of quality most relevant for school readiness. And with the class, how the highly inferential rating process may limit inter-rater reliability and the limited empirical evidence for theoretical dimensions. So to give you background, the ECRs was developed in the 1970s from a checklist to help practitioners improve the quality of their settings, and it reflects the concept of developmentally appropriate practice. So a predominance of child-initiated activities, a child approach, more that broad approach that Steve mentioned. There is teacher facilitation of responsiveness to age-related and individual needs. There's a standard stop scoring structure that reflects the checklist practice and philosophical origin. The categories have 1 to 7 scales. I'll show you an example in a minute. There's a bunch of indicators under each scale score, 400 indicators for 43 items. And the stop scoring means conditions of lower indicators have to be met before indicators of higher scores can be evaluated. And especially within some items, there's a mixture of different aspects of quality, often around a practitioner's lens. So this is the meals and snacks items. And the important thing to draw from this, I know you can't read it all, is that you see a number of indicators under each of the odd-numbered items, and those first 5 must be met before the observer looks to see if those on a 3 are met, the 3 before 5, the 5 before 7. That's the stop scoring. And to see the mixing of different aspects of quality, the 2 with the red arrow deal with health and sanitation. Others are more focused on social interactions, like the staff sitting with children and children helping to set the table. And still others might be relevant for both social and cognitive development, whether the teacher engages the children in conversation. Importantly, the stop scoring doesn't allow the centers to get credit for those blue and red indicators if they don't meet the blue and green, indicators, if they don't meet those at the bottom, the red. And this scoring might not be ideal for measuring quality to relate to child development, because we probably want an independent assessment of what we think matters for social development and language development, independent of health and safety. And in fact, our analyses suggest that mixing these different aspects of quality reduces the scale's validity. If there is the kind of higher scores reflect higher quality, we would expect a stair-step type of progression in average quality and in an IRT context for the category thresholds. But what we found when we looked at nationally representative ECLSB data was that there was lack of order, and that was true for the ECR's total score in terms of the average means. For each subscale score, you can see the lack of order there. And it was also true for the category thresholds in IRT, which is a more rigorous way to look at this, both for the total score, and for each of the subscales. And in our new work, we've been replicating this across data sets. We've now looked at these 10 data sets, which cover different historical time periods and populations, and in each case, we found that every ECRS item showed at least one pair of category thresholds that were not ordered. And I won't go into detail here, but this just shows some evidence without the stop scoring that it is these harder hand washing items that are leading to the problem. Okay, so I'm going to turn to class. Very different origins. Unlike the checklist and practice origins of the ECRS several days ago, it was developed more recently based on developmental theory and research and focuses especially on the teacher-child interactions. Its predecessor was part of a research study, and it was being used primarily for coaching and professional development before being used in the high-stakes ways we're seeing today. The manual requires observers to assimilate what they see in order to assign scores to just a few items. Very different scoring than the ECRS. And the manual advises in bold, because of the highly inferential nature of the class, scores should never be given without referring to the manual. Given this highly inferential rating, it's not surprising that a recent publication from the class developers revealed exact reliability is low, 40% overall exact agreement, with a master score in training of over 2,000 Head Start staff. And importantly, Black and Latino raters place their instructional support scores farther from the master score. Whoops, it's advancing without me, as did raters who disagreed with intentional teaching beliefs. We're also looking now at the extent to which the class may embed different aspects of quality within each item. And important to this question, the class developers also recently found a bifactor structure with one general dimension and two specific dimensions, which is different from their original structure and the structure written into policy. And we've been recently replicating those results and examining the targeting and the content of items and how those may be relevant to these findings. So stepping back from those details, as a whole, this body of evidence highlights the way in which measures developed for other purposes have been adopted for high-stakes policy uses. Not surprisingly, there's limitations in the validity of the measures for this high-stakes purpose. We think, consistent with the latest standards, that there's a need to step back and think about the intents of the policy uses, build in continuous and local validation of measures selected for high-stakes use, and allow for the refinement of measures over place and time. Thinking about big picture questions like what are the goals of public investments in preschool, and how do we design quality measures to help assure that we're meeting those specific goals. So just a couple of concrete examples. If it's desirable to distinguish classrooms that fall above and below specific thresholds, like those high-stakes uses I showed you in the QRIS, then measures with very high information and low error at those thresholds are needed. But instead, if we want to invest public dollars in improving quality through coaching, then we'd like a measure or two linked measures that cover the continuum of quality over which we expect growth. And as another example, it's essential to think carefully about variation in quality across children, classrooms, times of day, days of week, weeks of year. Dale has been thinking about this carefully with my colleague, Carrie Hoffer. Right now, we have very little evidence about that variation and the extent to which choices about when and how to observe classroom affects measures validity, including for high-stakes use. So I want to end on a hopeful note, even with these challenges, and tell you that I know the ECRS team is working on an ECRS 3 and making available a new scoring scheme. And the class team, I showed some of their new evidence about the scale's reliability and validity. The challenge is that policy continues to use the existing measures. I just showed the Illinois excerpts I showed are from a brand new Accelerate QRIS that they released just this January. So I think stakeholders from university and policy need to continue to work hard to translate evidence fast and to emphasize local validation. Just as an example, I'm currently working on an IES-funded research practice partnership in which the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning is working with the Washoe School District in Nevada to develop valid social and emotional measures. We analyzed the measure from their last spring collaboratively with the district staff, and we've revised the measure and are just fielding it this spring to see how it works, and we'll do that again in an iterative kind of process. All right, so let me bring back up our main slide so I can turn it over to Libby, who will discuss and tell us about exciting new policy directions.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. I am delighted to be here. I'm particularly honored to be with this panel because you are fortunate to get to hear them. They have been driving the research. They're doing such exciting work. And I think it's important for a policymaker representing the administration to be here to hear this and to let you know that we do care about the research and that we look at it very, very closely. And when Dale came out with her Tennessee study, while we were all a little sick about it, we were really interested in finding out, more and learning more, and are very eager to talk with her and hear from her. And I hope we leave time. I plan to leave time in the end of this for lots of discussion because I think that's critically important. I'm going to do three things. Talk to you briefly about the President's proposal because it is pretty exciting, and then kind of go back to what they've been saying and talk about areas of agreement, because actually I thought there was more agreement than disagreement, and then talk about what I see as some of the big policy questions still left to answer, and I guess that was really the focus of most of most of the research. The President proposal is pretty exciting. It builds on a $1 billion investment that we have already made in 20 states across the country. I hope some of you all are involved in what's going on in those 20 states. The story hasn't been told about what we are seeing because it's so very, very broad and diverse. But that $1 billion in 20 states is helping look at some of these systems, build some of these systems so that we can get quality in every setting. I think it's very clear from the research we've just heard about that quality matters. We need to learn to define it better. We also need to learn to figure out how to bring it to every setting. We didn't talk about this in terms of the research, but the early childhood community is a very diverse community. There's child care, which is funded really at a pretty low level so moms and dads can go to work. And we need to bring up the funding level. We need to bring up the quality. That is a major challenge for our country. There's Head Start that's been around for 4 decades. That's federal to state to local funding. It bypasses the state. It's pretty well funded. It's been around a long time. We're making some changes, as Steve noted, to improve it. We've got to make some more. And then there's the new pre-K, which is 50-state variety, or there are 10 states that don't offer it now, although that's changing it before our very eyes. So we have 50-state variety. Every state is doing it their own way, as Dale noted, and even within a state, classrooms can vary in terms of quality. So we have a major challenge out there. As for the President's initiative, it's not just a pre-K initiative. We do acknowledge that the whole early learning continuum from birth through age 5 is very, very important. At the Department of Education, we're even looking up through 3rd grade because we want to be able to sustain the gains, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the President's proposal, and part of it has actually, we have a little down payment, I'll talk about that, has 4 pieces. One is a major investment in home visiting. We didn't talk about it today, but it's a really exciting intervention. Once again, the research is varied. Some programs are better than others. Some outcomes are better than others. But we do know that there are ways to provide mothers, first-time mothers, second-time mothers, young mothers, at-risk mothers, and fathers, ways to do a better job in bringing up their children. We can't give up on parents because children, no matter how good the pre-K program is or the early childhood learning setting is, they're still spending a lot of time with their parents. So that is an acknowledgement that parents really do matter. There's also a major piece that's quite exciting around infants and toddlers. It's called the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships. We have a down payment on that at this point. $500 million will be released in the next next 6 months, 4 or 5 months. The applications will be available. We hope some of that money will go to every single state, and the goal of that is to improve the settings for infants and toddlers, because we've talked about pre-K, but lots of kids enter pre-K behind. So we want to make sure that our infants and toddlers are getting better care. This is a $500 million investment toward that end. Another piece of the President's proposal is preschool development grants. That we also got a small down payment on. That will be out of the Department of Education, and it's $250 million. We hope to release an executive summary about that in the next month that you'll have a chance to look at and comment on, and release a proposal this summer. That funding will go in 2 different directions. One is towards states that haven't done a lot around pre-K and help them build the system. So hopefully they'll be looking at the research. We'll direct them to that research to figure out how do we build a system that is high quality and really gets the outcomes that we all need. The other part of that funding will go to states more like Illinois, New Jersey, that already have a good system in place, and help them bring to scale in a couple of localities in their state, not the whole state because there's not enough money for that, but how can they bring pre-K for all to scale in a couple of localities. And then the fourth piece of the President's proposal is a $75 billion pot of money, and we haven't gotten that yet, unfortunately, but that would catapult the field of early childhood way forward. I think what's important about it would be voluntary for states to decide if they wanted to participate, and would ramp up over time so that states have time to build the high quality systems. In terms of what we've heard, I thought there was, as I said, more agreement than disagreement. I think we all agree that pre-K is not the only answer, and even though we were talking about it, I think I've read enough of everybody's research and their bios to know that we all really do care about low-income children, and how can we have better results so that we have a better schools, but also, more importantly, we have a better workforce going forward, and people with more happier, more successful lives. I think we all agree that quality is important. There's a lot of disagreement about how do you measure that, how do you look at that, what is it? I think we do know that intentional teaching is a part of that there needs to be some small group size, even one-on-one, which you can't get with high ratios. Coaching and mentoring seems to be important. I think we all agree that good preschool is unfortunately rare and hard to find, and hard to achieve. I think we all agree that we haven't effectively impacted language and math. We're doing okay on some of the social emotional. We're doing okay on getting kids ready to read, at least in terms of learning their letters and their sounds, but we really need to go a lot deeper. And I think we all agree that we need better data. We need teachers better able to collect ongoing data and make the continuous quality improvements that are so necessary. I think the questions that we all have are, should we do pre-K for all? I happen to be a friend of Steve's from way back and was funded by the Pew Charitable Trust to work on pre-K for all, so I have a little bias. But the President's proposal is really focused on children at 200%, with hoping that states would take that and let the federal government help with children up to 200%, and states would do more. That's still a question, though. Is for all better? We obviously get a better return for children at the lowest incomes, but if you provide it for all, do you have a more robust program? And then do you have some diversity in those classrooms? Because we know kids don't only learn from teachers, they learn from each other. I think everybody made the case of how do you scale up effectively? Even if you have a small program and you're doing it well, how do you take it to scale? I think the best example that Steve was the one that Steve gave, which is New Jersey Abbott, but they haven't taken it throughout the state. I think it's in 32 districts, Steve? 32 districts. But it is for all the children in those districts. I'm very, very concerned of how do we sustain the gains. I think we are making gains, but then we're not continuing to sustain those. I'm at the Department of Education, so I'm talking a lot to my colleagues. And what do we need to be doing better in kindergarten, first and second grades, so that we build on what children are bringing to school when they come from a high-quality preschool program. We didn't talk about this, but some questions I have as a policymaker is, 1 year? Do we need 2 years? Do we need full day? Do we need half day? I have to say, even when I've gone into high-quality classrooms, in the afternoon I see a lot of wasted time. And, how can we make use of the full day if we actually are funding a full day? Is it worth it? How do we measure quality? And I hope we can have some discussion about that, because that is critical. I think we have over-relied on the ECRs and the class. I was quite excited when the class came out. I think Rachel has pointed out its limitations. It was never designed to be a part of a QRS system or a part of what Head Start is using to judge quality, and now is being used very, very widely. So I'm glad to see that people are focusing on it, and I know that the people who have been involved in the design of class are very eager to make improvements in it. And then finally, we didn't talk as much about this, but what are the outcomes we really want? Are they cognitive? Are they social emotional? And what outcomes will be enough? When will we feel like we have gotten where we need to go? I'm happy that we're looking at quality and interaction and the continuous quality improvement. I'm happy also to see that states are designing kindergarten assessment instruments, but I'm also a little frightened about that because we need to figure out, is a child being in a high quality setting with a really skilled adult working all day, even if they don't come out with fabulous outcomes, is that better than they're sitting at home watching television with someone who has no training? I think there's lots that we don't know, but we do know that children are not spending their first 5 years as effectively as we'd like to see. And so now I'd like to open it up to a robust discussion, and we have 30 minutes left for that. Thank you.
Thank you all. Well, hopefully that stimulated some questions for everyone. I'm happy that we stayed in our time limit, so we have a good amount of time for a question and answer. So we have some questions from the audience.
There's a microphone.
Right over here? Oh, we have a
We have
microphone?
a couple of microphones.
Okay.
You have to sit in the back to talk.
Yes?
I have a question not directly related to the questions you posed, but I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and there is a lot of energy around the development of apps, particularly educational apps that would address the math and literacy readiness issues. Recognizing that this has potential implications for both teacher interaction versus the availability of quality teachers, as well as potentially interacting the social interactions and social interaction development. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the value, I guess, of moving forward in that direction. Thank you.
I haven't done much on that or know much. Do you, other people?
Well, I will say this. I think that the availability of cheap, small, well-functioning media is really upon us, and we need to figure out how to take advantage of that to use them effectively. just the media won't make them effective. It's going to be what we do with them. It's going to depend. But I've thought for a couple of years this is the place to go. We need particularly to get in there and figure out how do we create deeper interactions for children around materials, around learning things, around things they'll find exciting and interesting to do. But I don't think it's a concerted effort yet, and I'm concerned that it might get we might suddenly have a lot of toys out there and not, really being used appropriately.
It's very timely. I was just in Salt Lake City and gave a talk on high-tech tots. And I commented that actually everything I learned about high-tech tots I learned from my own grandchildren who are 9, 6, and 3. And it is amazing what children are doing when they saw my new Samsung Galaxy that I was so excited about. They immediately could figure out more than I could on how to use it. I think a couple of things. The early childhood community has been very, very behind in terms of using technology. And I think it's for a number of reasons. One is the field is underfunded. People who are poorly paid don't have a lot of tools for high-tech apps. I think center directors and principals haven't been leading like they need to lead. And there haven't been a lot of good apps. Just like there's junk food, and there's junk apps, and there are not a lot of good ones out there. So what I recommend is we really need principals and superintendents and those leaders in education to step up and to be leaders in technology. We need better apps, and I actually ask researchers and teachers to help direct that, and let's bend technology toward our needs instead of buying what they're giving us. And let's actually do some research around what is working, because it is a way to individualize. It is a way to take children to a higher level. It's a way to deepen learning, and I don't think we've even scratched the surface in early childhood and technology.
One addition, and then we'll get to other questions. Sorry, because we did a lot of work with the building blocks pre-kindergarten math curriculum, and it has very interesting computer programs that are directly linked to the instruction that the teacher's giving. And a lot of the apps and things like that are just sort of floating out there. They don't help children sustain or explore more deeply learning they're also getting from their teacher. And I think when it's connected with what the teacher's doing and gives children a chance to go deeper, our research showed that it was really quite beneficial for kids. But it's that connection that matters. A teacher it still matters, and the interaction, right?
Is another question?
Okay, so when looking at your outcomes, you talked about school readiness being very clear when the children first left the pre-K environment. I'm really interested in answering the question, what happens in that classroom environment when you have more children who are ready to learn? Have you had the opportunity to look at that? Are there outcomes in those classroom communities, those learning communities, that might be benefiting from the readiness of those children who are experiencing pre-K?
I think that was to you. I think we need to figure out what's going on with kindergarten for sure. I think it's a very appealing idea that what's going on is that these gains are not being built upon and sustained when children go into school. The data don't suggest that. Our data suggests they keep learning at the same rate that they learned in pre-K, but that the children who didn't have pre-K learn very quickly in whatever they're being exposed to in kindergarten. And so it's sort of a developmental issue. Do you get it now or get it later if you're going to get it? Maybe there's some other things they should be getting in addition to what we see as sort of readiness skills that would take them farther.
Yeah. There's a set of studies on our website, nieer.org, by Clive Belfield, that look at what are the systemic impacts of preschool for all. Right? And this is a question that randomized trials aren't particularly good at, in fact, completely miss. unless they're randomizing by locality. Right? Because let's just take it as an example. I'm pretty convinced from everything I've looked at that when you improve my classroom behavior and executive functions, it has modest, if any, persistent impact on my test scores. It doesn't really affect my learning very much. What it affects is the learning of all the other kids in my classroom. Right? And that's where Clive's work suggests that if when you have a substantial number of kids whose executive functions, behavior in the classroom have changed in kindergarten, that you change what happens in kindergarten for all of the kids. And we need more research like that. Right? The same thing you could see if we bring up the entire low level in a classroom, and then we support teachers in changing their instruction. Right? That's going to have a much different impact than if teachers continue to teach kindergarten exactly the way they were before, with some kids coming in, and now you're just, so what are they learning when you repeat all of the things that they already know?
And I would just add from the work that we've been doing that we haven't always designed our studies, especially our large-scale studies, to test that question. And so I hope that we'll start investing more in that. The ECLSB that we each used is just looking at one kid in a classroom because it's around that focal child. So we got a couple questions over here.
Yes, I was involved in statewide alignment and systems building in Virginia for about the last 15 years, and I'm now a full-time professor in Chicago. I'm very happy and very interested, Rachel, in your work. I'm author trained and rated in both CLAS and ECHRS, and find them to be too complicated in practical terms as well as in terms of the research base that you found. My question is, and this was referred to by several of you, we're looking at the broad spectrum of system delivery elements that create positive outcomes for children. And we know that there are certain places where when we invest effort in professional development that we get more impact in terms of gains. Sort of my question and my comment is, how do we define, I know how we define, but how do we clearly define what quality is across systems? I work with Head Start, early care and education centers, public schools in Chicago. I'm getting burned out doing so. How do we define quality across these disparate systems? What aspects of quality are important, and how can we focus on these aspects of quality to make them explicit and understandable, and not just to researchers, but to practitioners on the ground? And how can we communicate what those significant and essential aspects of quality are so that we can begin to move in a more broad way towards implementing those aspects of quality?
That's a great question, and I'll start with a couple of comments, and then I'm sure the other panelists will have some as well. One thing I would say is that I think you're exactly right. In many ways, we have the right goal, and we haven't always had the right supports and infrastructure to get us there. So we've had the right goal recently to try to coordinate assessments across the different contexts that you talk about: childcare, preschool, Head Start. And historically, we had different ways to monitor and evaluate and different measures being used. So it was the right goal to try to coordinate them, but I was part of the City of Chicago's work group to try to think that through, and we were still trying to place existing measures into a coordinated context, really, rather than starting new. So I'm hoping that some of this discussion will help us start anew. The question, Libby kind of asked too, what's our goal, and how do we have measures that help us know if we're meeting that goal? And designing a measure for professional development is very different than designing a measure for are you above or below a cutoff, which is different from just self-monitoring. The other thing I'd say is the work I'm doing with the collaborative and the school district that I mentioned at the end, this is really, really hard. You know, we have some of the best researchers in this area and a school district that has tons of capacity, and it's still been really challenging to work on this. So I'm hoping we can build in more support for that kind of local look at whether the measures in particular, which is what I've been working with, work in those contexts. But the same is true for interventions and variation across local context.
I really believe we should have gone a different direction long ago. I think we should have started empirically in the classrooms, and we should have started broadly and then narrowed down to figure out the things that really matter, the elements that are really critical. Instead, we developed a lot of these instruments on the basis of our theoretical or hypothetical ideas about what's important, and then we impose them on those classrooms. So we have a lot of data that I'm not suggesting these are systems people can use, because they aren't. They're complicated research-based systems, but they are demonstrating some important elements of classrooms that are related to gains children make all the way up through first grade, which is as long as we've followed them. And they relate to things like negativity. These are not surprising things, but they relate to the emotional tone of the classroom and how much directing is going on. They relate to how much children get to initiate their own learning. I mean, these are things that once you could whittle down, you can whittle away some of our research instrument down to the elements that really matter. And I think that's a far better direction to go.
And I'd refer you to the State of New Jersey's Office of Early Learning website, because I think they created a toolbox that's aligned at each level of the system. So there are statewide early learning standards, right? The curricula you use has to be, at least to some extent, aligned with that. But then each teacher has a self-assessment validation system that's developed for the teacher to assess her own practice with respect to what it is we want kids to learn and what is it we expect teachers to do. And the teacher also has a performance assessment tool to use in assessing the kids in her classroom along the same lines. That's kind of a simpler system to use than many of the performance assessments that we have, where the teacher basically ends up spending all of her time collecting data or testing kids and not actually teaching. And then there's there are a set of corresponding aligned tools for the coaches to use, which are not the same tools, right? These are tools for the coach to use to assess the teacher, for the tools that provide information for the coach on how the kids are doing. And there's a set of center-level tools that provide the same information all aligned, and then the state's collecting data on samples of kids and classrooms aligned with the same thing, using different sets of instruments. And I think you need that whole set of things, all the way from tools that are designed for teachers to use to improve their own practice, tools that are designed for the people who are helping teachers improve their practice, and then tools that are designed more for the monitoring and accountability and systems level continuous improvement. And they all need to be aligned, but they all need to be different.
Great, thanks. Another question?
Hi, my name is Carol Johnson, and I'm going to make one comment which kind of piggyback on Steve's comment, and then I have a question. I'm in Boston, and what I would say about the work that we've done around early childhood is it's consistent with some intentionality, both about the expectations we have, and then the curriculum, the specific selection of curriculum, and then the coaching and support. Furthermore, I would say that we did make a decision to have our schools look to move to NAEYC accreditation, which gave us both a common language and a common standard from which to work, and then the coaches a common set of work to operate around. But I think one of the more critical things that you haven't mentioned that I think is really important is that we developed a network of our principals who had these early childhood programs in their schools, and they're sharing across schools and their observations across schools. In addition to the support, I think created a network that was more than just a single classroom or 2 or 3 classrooms in a school, but kind of a whole school thrust, which allows you to then begin to move from just the pre-K to thinking more about how is this going to be sustained all the way through 3rd grade literacy. And I mean, I think that, you know, we're not at the end of this, but the NAEYC gave us an external validation point, common language. It gave us a way to both bring principals and actually classroom teachers and coaches kind of together in this network of sustainability. The question I guess I have is relative to the fact that most of the school districts are seeing such a large increase in autism and special needs students. And of course, this is partly due to the early screening that we're doing, but how you think about universal preschool in the same sort of, with the sort of the resource needs that are definitely being challenged given the increase in students with special needs, especially on the autism spectrum.
I'll start and let one of my researchers finish. Thank you for what you're doing with principals, and I mentioned the earlier principals in terms of technology, but I hope everybody, whether you're implementing or you're looking at research, will look at principals and what we could do, because so often they come in from the higher grades and don't really know about early learning. They don't know what a preschool program should look like. They think it should look like 1st grade. They're really a little bit taken back when they see a high-quality preschool program and don't understand what's there. So we need to do work. I have a daughter who does walkthroughs with principals in Texas, and you know, gives them checklists of what they should look for and helps educate them. And we need that and a lot more. I'm glad to see that the Foundation for Child Development is doing principals training as well. In terms of the children with disabilities, we haven't been successful at getting increased funding for the 619, which is the program for children, 3 and 4-year-olds with disabilities. I do not understand how we could have such a focus on preschool, and yet that funding has lagged behind, and it's certainly been a goal of ours to see increases. You know, I do think that as preschool rolls out, that we need more intentionality on bringing those 2 programs together, because I think all children will benefit. But there is a resource scarcity that could make it very difficult to happen. I'd love to talk with you, actually, because I think what you all are doing in Boston is quite exciting. Thank you.
I would just add that one of the reasons our maximum class size is 15 in New Jersey is because we designed the system so that the primary supports for children with disabilities would be in the regular classroom. And we didn't feel like we didn't believe that a larger class size was really feasible to achieve the results we wanted for kids and fully integrate children with disabilities. Some of the districts report that they identified twice as many kids with disabilities once they were enrolling all of the kids at 3 as they had before, when it was, you know, how do you identify 3-year-olds that you don't see, right? But they dealt with the problem by transferring or transitioning the staff that they had teaching in self-contained preschool classrooms to being support staff for teachers in regular classrooms and working with kids in the regular classroom. In some districts, essentially doing away with self-contained preschool special education.
Yes, question on this side?
Thank you. My name's Clara Mushkin. I'm with the Sanford School at Duke University. My question goes back to the idea of benefits of preschool going beyond the those benefits that accrue to the children who directly participate. I've been involved in a study that looks at the impact of statewide programs in North Carolina on a number of outcomes once children enter third grade, and we've found that we're actually looking at investments in these two statewide programs and their impact on individual children as they go through school. So we're looking at actually effects across all children and not specifically on those who participate, so community-wide effects. And it's in using this approach, we found effects that persist all the way through 5th grade, and they're strong and significant and cover both academic and non-academic outcomes for kids. So this, and we are thinking that the only way that we could explain that persistence and level of effect is really that there is considerable spillover from these programs from participants. But one of the programs, Smart Start, is not targeted. The other, More at 4, is a targeted program for 4-year-olds. And yet, if we look at the effects across all children, there must be some of this positive spillover partly from being in classrooms with children who are ready to learn and don't need as much remediation. So my question specifically about Tennessee is there a possibility of looking sort of beyond the tracking of what you've done with children and see if there are, to identify this kind of community aggregate level impact or impact of the programs across all children, and also sort of more broadly whether this or this similar kinds of information are what is it that policymakers can really use in making decisions about investing in early childhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Helen Ladd was just with us, and I know that she's been actively involved in that study, and so we had a chance to talk, and it's great work. So I'm in a lot of classrooms, and I have a different study that involves 30 classrooms in North Carolina and then 30 classrooms in Tennessee. North Carolina, and I spent many years in North Carolina. So North Carolina's, despite our concerns about the ECRs in terms of being used in the rating systems, North Carolina was always totally committed to that being the floor for good practice, and we do see those effects in our classroom observations. The classrooms in North Carolina look quite different from the classrooms in Tennessee, which is what concerns me a little bit about the scaling up and just saying pre-K. And when I know that those two systems both use the word pre-K and are quite different from each other. And our data also suggested that kids make more gains in those North Carolina classrooms than they do in our Tennessee classrooms. So, but that wasn't a comparison against that. The counterfactual was being in preschool but without a particular curriculum. So we don't have that compared to not being in preschool. I do think that our access to the state database will allow us to pursue the kind of questions you're talking about, which is because they did, the systems rolled out their programs at different rates and with different intensity. So clearly there was a different level of interest in the schools, in the counties, in the pre-Ks. And so we can look at those counties where the pre-Ks have been there longer. I think that part of it, what you're seeing is a spillover, but it also may be, in those counties, a commitment to children that's different from some other counties, so it's hard to disentangle those two things.
All right, I think that we are supposed to end at 12:55, so why don't we take one last question?
Okay, thank you. My name is Magina Baker. I'm with Boston College, and I write curriculum for the Boston Public Schools kindergartens as well. And I've heard you speak a lot today about evidence-based curricula. I think Dr. Barnett, you mentioned that as part of the New Jersey program. And I wanted to voice a concern that sometimes the very best programs in early childhood are very hard to, they're hard to define. The Reggio Emilia approach is a transformative approach to early childhood education. It's had tremendous global impacts. We're drawing upon it as we do our work in Boston. That's now getting a lot of national attention. But you can't, it's not evidence-based. I don't think you could say that. So I'm just wondering about how you would consider drawing upon some of those traditions going forward as we look to scale up high-quality early childhood.
Well, certainly I would say evidence-based doesn't mean that you've had a randomized trial on that curriculum, or, you know, even other kinds of, I mean, it's rigorous studies of that curriculum specifically. And I think, in fact, our whole approach to the horse races on brands is probably not a very good one. That we ought to be doing theory testing about curriculum development rather, and this may tie into what Dale was saying about her approach in terms of an empirical approach to what works in classrooms. So I think we have, you know, we have both, we have theory, which is empirically validated, and we have a large set of studies about things that work better than other things in terms of pedagogy that need to be brought to bear when you're talking about what's an evidence-based curriculum. And having said that, I think there are a lot of questions to answer about moving Reggio Emilia from Reggio Emilia to the United States and thinking that the same things are going to happen.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for those terrific questions from the audience. I think they really added, and thank you to all of our panelists in discussion. And feel free to come up if we didn't get a chance to hear your question. Thanks, everyone.